the framing around taxpayer money is so problematic. I'll get into specifics about Medicare for All in a second, but I think the first thing is just to think about what it is when we say taxpayer dollars, what we are implying here. There's a couple of things. First of all, we're giving the impression that before we can conduct any coherent, rational discussion of an investment program or a spending program, the first thing we need to address, the most important political question, is how to find the money, not necessarily how to ensure it's inflation neutral or how to ensure that it's the best place to find the money, but if we cannot identify a single pay for, we actually can't go ahead with the policy. And I think this is wrong. There are plenty of policies that we propose, and certain questions are not worked out until later, or they're not worked out until after we've got agreement that the general policy is worth doing. Just to give an example, we've had public education systems, universal right to education systems going back to the mid to early 19th century. And the question of what we're actually teaching is an evolving question. It's still up for debate. If somebody said back in the 19th century, I think we should have a universal right to education, and someone said, what does that mean to you? And then they sort of listed the specific curricular requirements of any high school in the country right now, they would look at you like you're crazy. But that didn't stop us from being able to have a debate about what a right to education looked like back then, or to say that we should have it and have it to be administered through public institutions funded with public money. And the reason this is important is because what we mean by Medicare for All at the sort of filamental level, at the level of particular people getting particular amounts of healthcare, is going to be up for debate. How we administer it, how we provide that service to people, is going to be a matter of debate. And we are not saying that we should hold off on advocating for Medicare for All until we solve all of those questions in a specific way. We acknowledge that this is an ongoing, iterative, experimental process. Yet when it comes to the financing, the assumption is we need to have one fixed answer for where all this money is going to come from. Otherwise, we can't do anything. And I think what the MMT analysis shows is if you want to pay for something, as Stephanie Kelton says, if you have the votes, it's paid for. Now, does that mean the economic effects are going to be optimal? Maybe not. Maybe you want to be constantly revising, assessing, experimenting with how to best manage the economic effects of that program. But the idea that we cannot go ahead with a commitment, the idea we cannot start enacting Medicare for All until we've resolved every possible eventuality regarding inflation or anything else, I think is just wrong. It's not how we decide whether or not to spend on the military or spend on any other national priority. And it shouldn't be when we're talking about something so important as healthcare. The other aspect of the taxpayer narrative is that it's overly narrow in its framing of how demand and sources of spending actually affect inflation. And what I mean by that is that right now, and for most of, for example, US history, but certainly the history of other countries, the default state of being is that the government is running a deficit. It's injecting more money into the economy than it is taking out. That is increasing the net savings of private actors. It's accumulating elsewhere in the world with foreign outflows. And nothing is unsustainable about that net deficit position. But we get confused that the deficit is financed or is accompanied by the issuance of bond sales. And as a result, think that what we're doing when we run a deficit is fundamentally different than creating money and injecting it into the economy. We're not creating money, we're just borrowing money, which means it's somehow only using the existing stock or the existing supply of money, so it kind of doesn't count. And I think that's wrong, and that's what one of the things that MMT shows is wrong, is that whenever you're running a deficit, whether the instruments or the funds that you're spending into the economy end up staying there in the form of reserves or physical currency, or more commonly perhaps bonds, the effect is largely the same. Printing yellow money in the form of bonds or printing green money in the form of reserves, as Stephanie Kelton says, doesn't have too much difference. So when we're looking at the question of how to fund something, at least in my opinion, the default presumption should be we just spend the money into existence. And then we can look at whether or not that has effects we want to mitigate. The other thing is to think about the fact that at any point in time, there are all sorts of sources of credit-led demand in the private sector that have an equivalent economic effect to creating and injecting money. Not in every sense. There are ways in which that can be more destabilizing and have distributional effects, but in the sense of generating purchasing power. And the example I use is if somebody goes to a bank and wants to get a loan to fund the development of a new casino, say in Nevada, you're going to have to get bricks and electrical engineering capacity and construction labor and all of those kinds of things to make that casino, just as if you got money from the government to build a school or a hospital. We don't look at the source of private credit and put it next to the source of government spending when we hit real resource barriers and say, oh, there's too many bricks being used. Maybe we should have less casino loans so that we can keep the same amount of schools and hospitals. We say, oh, there's inflation. We should be spending less on government spending programs. Meanwhile, all of these sources of private investment stay invisible. They stay invisible to our narrative. They stay invisible to our number crunching that goes on the news and all those kinds of things. Why this is important, I think, is because when we're looking at questions of real resource capacity and what is laying claim on real resources, there's a tendency, even I think for people who've heard the MMT 101 story, to assume that the only place to look is with the public spending side of things. Whereas in reality, at the point we start coming close to real resource limits, we always and must look at both the private investment and public spending channels in parallel and evaluate where our respective priorities are between what those two systems are doing. The last thing about the taxpayer money point is just that when we think of money coming exclusively from taxpayers and not from A, the infinity sign in the sky that the government has access to, or B, private credit always being generated out of private relationships in that sort of negative space between creditors and debtors, we center the taxpayer as the sort of dominant social actor at the heart of our fiscal system. If we don't have the ability to tax people enough, if we don't have the ability to extract more resource space from taxpayers, then we don't have the ability to do anything. In the sound finance narrative, that's literally money. But even in a sort of crude MMT narrative, that's the idea that the first place that we should be looking to free up real resources is on individual taxpayers. The reason this is a difficult starting point is because oftentimes the very, very rich are not consuming the resources that we might actually need to build core public infrastructure. So if we're talking about freeing up resources through taxation, that might actually mean suppressing the purchasing power, consumption power of those most in need of having that protected, the very poorest people. And we're seeing a sort of example right now with the fact that the COVID response actually helped protect a lot of incomes at the lower end. And as a result, a lot of people had purchasing power that they invested in things like goods that were suffering shortages that we're now seeing price pressure in. And one response to that is, well, we should, raise taxes to suppress demand. But raising taxes on Elon Musk and Bill Gates is unlikely to stop the demand for second-hand cars, for example. So if we're really talking about suppressing demand in that context, we're talking about taking money back away from the very kind of people that might be in a position to purchase goods, which really means the people whose incomes we were trying to protect in the first place. So when we center the taxpayer themselves, what we're often doing is centering those with the ability to pay and saying that they are the sort of goose that lays the golden egg that we always have to modulate their ability to pay in order to free up real resources. But in fact, as I just said, in the long run, it's that new expansion of purchasing power. It's the ongoing sources of government deficits. It's the ongoing sources of private credit investment that are not taking from somebody else, but are actually just expanding sui generis not out of thin air necessarily, but out of individual relationships. That is the most important long run source of additional demand and purchasing power. And the fight over that, I think, is a much more constructive fight than the fight over pure redistributionist policies, especially when they're likely to hit real people. Second point is about this idea of real resources. And I think one of the challenges here is when you think of dollars, it's really, really easy to treat them as fungible. You need more capacity over here, you take it from over there. How do you know you've taken the right amount from over there to increase spending capacity over here? And the answer is that the dollars are the same. You need $1 billion over here, well, you just tax $1 billion from over there, and then look, the numbers add up. What MMT encourages us to think about is the fact that those numbers are not always equal. And again, a simple example I use is you give $1 billion to a school lunch program to provide free milk to kids, and you take $1 billion away from Bill Gates. Is that likely to have a neutral effect on the price of milk? No, of course not. Bill Gates is not spending $1 billion on milk in his household every week. And similarly, the Mississippi Lunch Program is likely to put all of that money into milk. So the effect on specific prices is likely to be quite different depending on where you send that money. As a result, when we think about real resource capacity, we need to not think of it as a purely fungible sort of abstract ball of demand or ball of productivity, and think about it in terms of specific resources, specific needs. And what that means is, if we are looking at real resource constraints in the healthcare sector, for example, we need to have a very targeted set of policies designed to increase that capacity. And I'll just give a couple of examples. The first one, the most obvious one that I spend a lot of time thinking about, is intellectual property. We currently have a regime where copyright, patent, and to a lesser extent trademark and other things play a very large role in the distribution of wealth, income, and power in sectors like healthcare that rely a lot on knowledge and rely a lot on technological advancement for productivity increases. Currently, we have a system where a huge amount of public money, both through universities and through other research investment, goes into private research that then the results of which are allowed to be captured by those actors and turned into intellectual property goods that they can then monetize and charge rents on, even when the initial investment comes from public money. The National Institutes of Science, National Institute of Health, university grants, all those kinds of things that are using public money end up creating privatized goods. The result is that we monetize and commodify a very large part of the knowledge commons in ways that even if you pay, drastically alter the ability of others to build on that knowledge and to grow from it. And to give one basic example from the world that I come from, it will often cost $30, $50, even $100 to access an academic article through one of the publishing houses like Elsevier. Now, the effect of that is that most people do not have access to that information. Whether or not most people are going to use it is a different question, but the number of people that might have a brilliant breakthrough or have something to contribute to that conversation that currently don't because they're excluded is very high. Now, one way to fix that would be to give every university and every researcher access to a paid Elsevier account, subsidize it, give everyone a sort of a research library access credit. The other option would be to attack the patents, the copyright system that allows Elsevier to charge those prices in the first place. They have very, very different effects. Just as promoting open patents or an alternative way of conducting pharmaceutical research is very, very different than letting private actors conduct that research and then trying to buy the products at market prices or at some sort of price that is set within markets but subject to the government's strong bargaining position as a monopsony buyer or something like that. So what that means is that if we really want to think about real resources here, we need to go beyond just saying we're going to sort of tax demand and free up space to actually look at how we are going to revitalize that ecosystem so that the resources are not being constantly privatized. Another example from where I come from, Australia, we have a public healthcare system there. It's a hybrid system with private healthcare. But even with that public healthcare system, we have been dealing with questions of bottlenecks and shortages, particularly in specialized areas. We're a small country with a relatively small population, even though it's quite highly educated and skilled. And a colleague of mine who works with the shadow health minister and talks about this a lot, which is that the access to specialist qualifications is largely restricted on the supply side by the existing specialists in those disciplines. So if you're doing, thoracic heart surgery or something, to be accredited as a thoracic heart specialist, you need to do your regular medical training and then go through specialist training and then go through additional specialist training. But then you might have to sit an exam, and the passage rate on that exam, the passing level, is set by the board of thoracic surgeons, who decide they only want 3 to 5 new surgeons a year. Because if there are more than that, then the price of their living, their profession goes down. The value of the services they provide, or the ability that they can have to charge higher rates, goes down. So you can have free healthcare training. You can have medical school be largely free. You can have a free healthcare system or a public healthcare system and all those things. But as long as you have this bottleneck at the very top of the thoracic surgeon profession, you're going to have an undersupply of that particular service. The same is true for all sorts of other highly specialized areas. And there isn't really a demand-led solution to that. It requires, again, a sort of change of the regulatory regime, a change of the industrial structure, and potentially picking a fight with the very healthcare providers who you're going to need to have on the other side actually providing these services. This isn't an easy challenge to overcome. This isn't an easy political problem to deal with, but it does require us to understand that the problem here is nothing to do with whether we can pay for it, but rather the process by which people will take prices and will let people into specific professions. The last point on this is just when we think about price stability itself, the same problem emerges, which is that we can't simply press a button and make more hospitals or make more doctors. It takes time, and it takes a reorganization of existing resources, which in the meantime can be destabilizing, or can require the sort of disemployment of resources in certain areas before it will show up in other areas. Right now, we don't have perhaps enough people becoming nurses or social workers or other things like that. But one of the reasons for that is because there's a lot of other industries that are attracting people into them with promises of higher incomes and more stable careers and better quality of living and those kinds of things, which, as long as they exist, will always be there as an alternative to doctors and to nurses and social workers. If you promise to make social work training free and increase the pay available to social workers, that doesn't mean that's instantly going to sort of make it an adequate alternative, as long as other industries might be able to, again, outcompete or offer even higher wages for the kinds of people that we need to become social workers, nurses, things like that. The effect there means that we need to think very carefully about not only making sure the money is there, but making sure the broader social structures, values, culture, and things are there such that people can feel safe and feel accepted and feel successful in becoming part of this new program. And just to give one example of that, and then I'll close up, the Civilian Conservation Corps in the 1930s was responsible for planting millions of trees. It's one of the examples that myself and other MMTers often talk about as a great example of how a job guarantee could help with a Green New Deal or a sustainable transition. But one of the ways it did that was it took a lot of 18 to 21-year-olds, often men, people that otherwise might be joining the military or something like that, and had them live in camps, very far away from their homes, often sort of the equivalent of a long distance, a long-term hiking or something like that. They were kind of on the road doing this work, living with others in almost like barracks situations. A lot of people might not want that kind of lifestyle today for various reasons, or if they were going to have that lifestyle, we would have to make sure certain amenities were available to them. The same thing is going to be true when it comes to something like a public healthcare program. If you're looking for example, people to go into rural areas or to provide services that might be available 24/7, requiring people to work night shifts that otherwise might want to be connected to their children during the day, or connected to broader social services that are only available from a 9 to 5, those kinds of things. Right now, if you work those kinds of night shifts, then you accept that you might not have access to all of those services and amenities. But if we really want to make them attractive in the future, then we need to be thinking about that broader conception of resource allocation and production beyond simply the direct services we need for provision of healthcare, but rather making universal, permanent, all the time service availability something that our entire economy and society is geared around. All of which is to say that the question of how to pay for it is a very complicated question, but has much less to do with money than it does to do with social structure and industrial structure. And the quicker we can get away from centering the taxpayer as the sort of goose that holds the golden egg of money, and more towards the questions of labor and industrial structure that are really going to affect how we provide healthcare, I think we're going to be in a better place.